These are 2 bottles of Cabernet Sauvignon. This one costs $18. This one costs $300. And if you ever wondered why, I'm gonna explain that to you today. Hey, I'm Sommelier André Hueston Mack, and today I have 4 different types of Cabernet Sauvignon, ranging in price from $18 all the way to $300. And I'm gonna break it down to tell you why they cost what they do. Let's face it, wine can be an expensive hobby, right? And constantly, I think it's one of the things that we buy that we're really kind of budget conscious of. Today, I have 4 different bottles of Cabernet Sauvignon. We have one for $18, $59, $135, and also $300. There's several different factors on why wine is priced the way that it is. It could be region, it could be the grapes that they use, it could be packaging, it could be glass, but I'm gonna break that down for you today. So the first factor is region. So Cabernet Sauvignon is the king of grape varietals, and it does really well in California and flourishes because of the weather and the climate. All of these wines are from California, and what you'll notice as we go from least expensive to the most expensive, there's more detail on the label about where these wines come from. The more detailed you get, the more essence of the place of which it came from you would get. The French actually call this terroir. Terroir is interesting. There's no direct translation in English, but it means pretty much sense of place. You're gonna pay more money for the grapes in that specific vineyard to get that taste or that microclimate of from where the grapes are grown. So we're gonna go ahead and open these now. We're gonna start with the California wine, the $18 wine, and then kind of move our way up. If you look at the back label, that's generally where you'll find that information, but here it just also just says California. So Cabernet is actually the offspring of Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. So you get like some of this freshness from like Sauvignon Blanc. Cabernet Franc has a little bit of greenness to it as well. But you get red berries, a little currant, a little bit of red fruit, a little bit of black fruit. There is a little bit of vanilla, a hint of vanilla. I would attribute that to maybe the oak. That's pretty good. This is actually a really great and well-made California wine. I think what we don't get here is some of the nuances and the more detailed notes that you would get as we start to move further in and get more specific about the location that the wine comes from. So now we're moving on to Napa Valley, and now you're paying for Napa Valley fruit, Napa Valley wine, which is more specific than, say, California. There's a price attached to Napa Valley. So Napa Valley is one of the most famous and renowned wine regions in the world, not just here in America. What makes it really special is its microclimates and its different types of soil. So before we talked about the previous wine, herbs here, you also get herbs, but more specifically, you get rosemary, you get a little bit of sage, you get more, lavender. Cassis is a big one. A little bit of, I smell a little lead. This really kind of helps explain the price. You're paying for Napa Valley fruit. You're paying for these subtle nuances that you get that you don't really pick up in something that maybe is for $18. So our next wineup is my Camas Vineyard. This is $135. This is also from California, also from Napa Valley, but more specifically from Mount Veeder. Oh man, so here you get it's just really intense. Current, here there's definitely graphite or lead, but more like pencil shavings. It reminds me of going up to sharpen my pencil as a kid. That's pretty amazing. The cool part about all of this is that as we started to get more detailed about where the wines come from and we kind of went up in price, the wines have come really more expressive, right? So I think when we started with the first wine, it was just like red and black fruit, it was herbs, and as we started to progress, it becomes more apparent and more detailed. Rosemary, sage, graphite, pencil, currant, cassis, and that's really what you get as you start to get more of a sense of place in the wine. So this is Diamond Creek Winery. This is from Red Rock Terrace. This is Cabernet Sauvignon, and this costs $300. I know, $300. We're gonna open this up and we're gonna taste this. So this is Cabernet Sauvignon from California, also Napa Valley, also from a specific AVA called Diamond Mountain, and then also from a specific vineyard located in that AVA called Red Rock Terrace. Just to kind of give you a scope of what's happening here, the first time we tasted was from all over California. It could be from anywhere in California. And now we've kind of narrowed it all the way down to just 7 acres. And so when you think about from $18 all the way to $300, that's what you're paying for. For lack of a better term, it smells polished. It's so funny, like I'm gonna get killed for that. That's not a real wine term, but that's kind of the way that I explain it. This smells like Cabernet. It has all of those notes, cassis. There's a little bit of cinnamon. There is a little bit of manure. You know how I like my manure. You have vanilla, tobacco, truffle, damp earth, like wet dirt. It talks about the microclimate of just these 7 acres that you won't get anywhere else in the world. The largest jump was from wine number 3 at $135 to $300. And why is that? We went just from a single AVA to a single vineyard. But the whole idea behind that is just, it's about soil and it's about a sense of place. You can really tell it in Europe when you walk through the vineyards in Burgundy. You walk to one place and you can see where the soil changed, and you step on that line, and that's considered one of the most premium areas, which they call a Grand Cru vineyard, and this here is called a Premier Cru. So it's really that close. It could be that close, and it can jump in price extremely. Next time you're in a wine shop, look at the details on the label. The more specific about that particular wine is probably what you're paying for. So factor number 2 is storing and aging. So there's a couple of different types of aging. There's the aging where you age it in an oak vat or oak barrel, and then there's also aging it in the bottle. Generally, the barrel comes first, and then it's put into bottle, and then that's where the storing part comes. So oak does several different things. It imparts flavor. It also helps set the color during the winemaking process, and it also imparts tannin, wood tannin, into the wine to give the wine longevity. Is oak and that aging discernible in the palate? Yes, it is. I mean, if we look at something like this, when we talked about before, more nuanced, right? So when I start to smell, I smell cedar, right? I smell a little bit of vanilla. Those things come from brand new French oak. And if we look at like something like Sidekick, not to like pick on Sidekick, but like something here, there is a woody element to it, but it's not expressive of like the way that oak is present here. This is more concentrated, jumps out of the glass, it screams, I've spent some time in oak, where here it's a little bit more subtle. Something like Diamond Creek at $300 a bottle is aged for 12 months, so 1 year, in 100% brand new French oak barrels. So each year they're buying barrels to make this particular wine. And this is reflected in the price because we're talking about brand new barrels, at $1,200 a pop here every single year. So once you toast the barrel and actually use it from 1 year, they basically lose half their value. As we move on to Mayacamas, what's interesting about this winery is that they don't use any brand new oak at all. There's no barrel cost here. They bought the barrels once and they've been using them. I believe some of the barrels might be, 50, 60, 70 years old. It's a combination of barrel and large wooden vat. So this wine actually spends 32 months in barrel before it's even bottled and released to the consumer. Also, I believe that it spends another 12 months in bottle before it's released. So you're talking about almost 4 years that you don't see any return on this wine. And then so something like Steady State, here they're using 40% of the wine is aged in oak, brand new French oak barrels, and the rest is done in neutral barrel. So it's a little bit more cost effective than say something like using 100% brand new French oak like they do at Diamond Creek. Now we're gonna move on to vineyard costs. I guess the easiest place to start would be land costs. Vineyards required land where the grapes are grown, and that is a huge cost. If we're starting at $1 million here per acre for our $59 bottle of wine. As we start to progress and get to our $300 bottle of wine, the costs just go up. Napa Valley is the premier growing region in the United States. That's why you're paying $1 million. That's just for the raw land. Generally, it costs anywhere from $35,000 to $42,000 to put a vineyard on that raw land. So if you look at something like this, that's 7 acres. So that's 7 times $35,000, that's to plant the vineyard. If it's 7 acres, it's $7 million, if not more. And so all of those inherent costs of the land are passed on to you, the consumer. If you look at old world wines, the lands and the vineyards have already been paid for 10 times over. They've owned that property or that land for over 400 years. So that's not really passed on to the consumer. If you bought a $50 bottle of wine from the United States and a $50 bottle of wine from France and kind of felt like, wow, you got more value for your money out of the European wine, inherent land costs is probably one of those factors in that. Most vineyards don't produce any fruit that you can actually make into wine into what we call third or fourth leaf. So that's 3 or 4 years that you have to wait, that you can't make any wine in it, you don't get any profit from. So now that we're on our 3rd or 4th leaf, now it's time to harvest the fruit so we can make wine. If you use a machine, generally you're using it to harvest a large vineyard, right? And so it's definitely economical that way and costs less money. If you're hand harvesting, it's in areas that you really can't get into, hillsides, all of those different kinds of things. You get a better selection, but it takes a team of people, which is more labor intensive, and that is also passed on to you, the consumer. So another factor when you plant or harvest your vineyard is how many tons per acre you're gonna produce. So if you produce a lot of tons per acre, 7, 8, 9, 10, you're gonna get more fruit, but less quality fruit with less concentration. Not a lot of nuance. If you're doing 1.5 acre, you're gonna get a better developed wine with also a lot more flavor and depth. Definitely if we're looking at California Cabernet, under $20, generally it's probably harvested at a pretty large ton per acre. 1.5 is kind of the standard when you're looking at like some of the top vineyards that you're gonna pay the price for. So we're gonna move on to vintage. Vintage is just the year that the grapes were harvested. There's non-vintage wines, but these are vintage wines, so these are vintage dated. We've kind of already moved a step up. These are vintage dated wines, which is a sign of quality. A good vintage simply means that they were the prime growing conditions to produce ripe fruit to make great wine. We're up against Mother Nature, and it's constantly throwing curveballs at you, weather, rain. I think one year that we had a harvest in 2010, we actually referred to that as the Albert Hitchcock vintage. 30% of the crop was lost due to the birds coming in and eating a lot of the fruit. You know, and vintage is important, but I think for your everyday drinking wines, that becomes less important. You know, so if you're looking at something like these two wines here, you're gonna consume these wines, have fun with them. As we start to move up in price point, we look at, you know, these couple of wines here, a lot of people use these as investments. They're gonna appreciate in value. If you're really into wine and collecting wine, then vintage matters. Right? And especially as you start to make more money, a lot of the more details is the same thing. The nuances in detail, you pay more attention to when you start to spend a lot more money. 2018 is considered a good vintage in California. When we talk about a good vintage, it's not only the growing conditions, it's also about longevity. Perfect growing conditions for some place like California means that we're gonna make these long-lived wines that actually don't start giving until 20 or 30 years after they've been made, especially when you're starting to listen to wine critics. At an everyday drinking level, it's more about pleasure and consuming those wines, and you need to pay less attention to vintage. I always have a rule of thumb, in great vintages, you wanna buy from everybody because it was hard to make bad wine that year. In bad vintages, you wanna buy from the best because they show a track record of making great wine consistently throughout the years. How do you know if it's a good vintage or not? By reading periodicals and what other people say, talking to the winery and those things, you can figure out whether it's a good year or not. At a certain price point, every year is the best year to drink the wine. So now we're gonna move on to marketing and packaging. So we're actually gonna look at the raw materials, so glass, foil, labels, and all those things, and the designs and stuff like that. I would have to say that this is probably not a major factor on the pricing. As we're kind of looking at like all the marketing for these 4 bottles here, you know, there's a vast difference in price, but from looking at everything collectively, there's not a vast difference in the amount that was spent on packaging. The consumer would never know, but the idea from a winery side, if you're spending more than $8 on packaging, that's considered expensive. So that would encompass everything. The glass is probably your major cost here. We truly live in a day and age now where you can't really judge a wine by its label. You know, they have really great labels and fun labels and kitschy labels that actually really have great wine inside. I think a lot of times when we use that term marketing, we feel like we're being duped or tricked. Everything that you do is marketing, even if you're anti-marketing. As we look at something like this, you know, this could be the $300 bottle of wine in the day and age that we live in now. I think, you know, maybe 20 years ago, this would just be unheard of. And most people would bypass that and look at something a little bit more serious. But those days are over. You know, there's a lot of great wine and interesting packaging. So the last factor we're gonna talk about is reputation, which I think for most people doesn't really come to mind, but it definitely plays a role in the price. You look at some of these higher end wines, you know, my comments at 135, Diamond Creek, you know, they've been making wine for years. They've kind of set the standard for American winemaking. They are at the very tip top of what the best we have to offer from the United States. You know what you're gonna get, you know what type of quality you're gonna get, and thus that's incorporated in the price as well. Versus some of the newer guys starting out, they can't demand the same kind of prices, even if they were doing the same quality of stuff, because there's not that reputation there. So they're still developing trust, whereas here they have over 50 years experience, if not more, of making some of the great wines in America. Here you can go right on their website. These are allocated. You sign up for the mailing list and they assign how much wine they want to sell you. So no matter what kind of vintage it is, a lot of people are still lined up and they still want to buy these wines based upon that trust and reputation. Yeah, so if we're looking at these 4 particular wines, I think the biggest factors, if I was going to rate them, would be region, that's a big one, vineyard, then we would move on to aging and barrel storage, and then from there, reputation and then marketing. I'm sure there's cynics out there, people out there to say, oh, this is $18 and this is $300, and you know the reason why that is because it's marketing. That's just not the case in this particular instance. There's definitely things that they do that make this cost more. There's a reason why these wines are priced the way that they are, and the biggest factor in that is that you can taste the difference. It's crystal clear that the wines are made differently, they taste differently, and what it takes to make this wine versus to make this wine is definitely reflected in the price.